He's awake before dawn in a house that still smells like her perfume. The Grammy sits on a shelf he hasn't dusted in months. The gold records line a hallway he walks alone. Engelbert Humperdinck, born Arnold Dorsey, reborn as a fantasy, sustained by applause for 60 years, spends his mornings now in a different kind of silence. His wife Patricia is gone. Alzheimer's took her slowly, then all at once. And the man who once made millions of women scream his name, who filled arenas with longing, who built an entire career on the illusion of eternal romance, is learning what devotion actually costs when the cameras turn off and the disease doesn't care how famous you are. This is not the story of a has-been. This is the story of a man who never stopped performing, even when the only audience left was the woman who knew him before the name, before the satin shirts, before the myth. And now she can't remember any of it. Most people under 50 have no idea who Engelbert Humperdinck is. Those who do remember him probably think of velvet tuxedos, Las Vegas residencies, and songs their grandmothers swooned to. They think of kitsch, a relic, a punchline wrapped in rhinestones. What they don't see is the man who stayed married to the same woman for 56 years, while the entire music industry built a brand around his availability. They don't see the affair that nearly destroyed that marriage. They don't see the decade of caregiving that came after the stages went dark. And they certainly don't see what's left when a man who lived as a fantasy finally has to face himself in an empty house. This is the story of what remains when the performance ends. Let's go back to the beginning, because the man we think we know never actually existed. Arnold George Dorsey was born in Madras, India in 1936 to a British army band leader and a mother who loved music more than stability. The family moved constantly. By the time Arnold was 10, they'd settled in Leicester, England in a cramped terrace house where every penny mattered and shame lived in the walls. His father was often absent, his mother was often silent. Arnold learned early that attention was earned, not given, and the only time people looked at him with anything close to warmth was when he sang. He had a voice even then, a voice too big for his body, too emotional for a working-class boy who was supposed to keep his head down and find a trade. But Arnold didn't want to disappear. He wanted to matter. So he started performing in pubs, working men's clubs, anywhere that would let a teenager with a borrowed suit and a borrowed dream stand in front of a microphone. By his early 20s, he changed his name to Jerry Dorsey and signed a record deal. It went nowhere. The songs flopped, the image didn't land, the industry chewed him up and spit him out without a second thought. And for most young singers, that would have been the end. But Arnold, still Jerry then, didn't quit. He kept gigging, kept surviving. And in 1959, at a dance in Leicester, he met a young woman named Patricia Healy. She was 18, dark-haired, shy, raised in a strict Catholic family that didn't approve of musicians or dreamers. But she saw something in him. Not the success he didn't have, not the fantasy he would later become. Just him, the anxious, driven, emotionally hungry man underneath. And for the first time in his life, Arnold felt seen by someone who wasn't applauding. They married in 1964. By then, Arnold's career had flatlined. He was 27, broke, still performing under a name nobody remembered. His manager, Gordon Mills, sat him down and delivered the hard truth. Jerry Dorsey was dead in the water. If he wanted to survive, he needed to become someone entirely. Mills didn't just suggest a new name, he engineered a complete transformation. He took Arnold, a working-class kid from Leicester with a decent voice, and turned him into Engelbert Humperdinck, a manufactured romantic fantasy built on an old German composer's name and the growing hunger for escapism in mid-60s Britain. The name was absurd. It was unpronounceable. It was perfect. It didn't sound real because it wasn't supposed to. It sounded like a myth. And myths sell. In 1967, Release Me became a global smash. It knocked the Beatles off the #1 spot in the UK. It sold millions, and overnight, Arnold Dorsey disappeared. In his place stood Engelbert Humperdinck, the sex symbol, the crooner, the man every woman wanted and every man wanted to be. The image was meticulous. The satin shirts, the open collars, the bedroom eyes, the songs dripping with longing and promises that sounded like forever. But here's the detail most people miss. Patricia was already pregnant with their first child when the fame hit. She wasn't part of the fantasy. She was the reality he came home to. And the gap between those two worlds would define the rest of their lives. Fame didn't just change Arnold's career, it changed the relationship between what he performed and what he actually felt. Every night he stepped on stage and sold intimacy to thousands of strangers. He made them believe he was singing to them, only them, that they were the object of his desire. It was theater, but theater requires a mask, and the longer you wear a mask, the harder it becomes to take off. Patricia stayed home. She raised their 4 children, Scott, Jason, Luis, and Bradley, while Engelbert toured the world. She managed the house, the schedules, the loneliness. She accepted that her husband's career required him to be desired by other women. That was the deal. That was the price of the life they'd built. But accepting something and surviving it are not the same thing. By the early 1970s, Engelbert Humperdinck was one of the biggest stars in the world. He headlined Vegas, he sold out arenas, he recorded schmaltzy ballads that made middle-aged women weep and younger audiences roll their eyes. The critics hated him, the industry mocked him, but the audiences kept coming. Because what he sold wasn't coolness, it wasn't rebellion, it was comfort. It was the fantasy that love could be simple, eternal, and sung in a velvet tuxedo under soft lighting. The irony, of course, is that his own love was anything but simple. In the late 70s, Engelbert had an affair. Her name was not widely publicized, the details were kept quiet, but Patricia found out. And for a woman who had sacrificed her youth, her independence, and her identity to support a man who made millions singing about fidelity, the betrayal was crushing. Most celebrity marriages would have ended there, but Patricia didn't leave. Not because she was weak, not because she had nowhere to go, but because she had built her entire life around the belief that their love, however imperfect, however tested, was real beneath the performance. She confronted him. They fought, and slowly, painfully, they rebuilt. Engelbert later said in interviews that Patricia's forgiveness changed him, that it forced him to see the difference between the fantasy he sold and the life he actually had, that it made him realize he'd been performing even at home, unable to separate the man from the myth. But forgiveness doesn't erase the wound, it just teaches you to live with the scar. The 80s and 90s were kinder in some ways, crueler in others. Engelbert kept performing, but the stadiums got smaller. The hits dried up. The younger generation had no idea who he was, and the older generation was dying off. He became a nostalgia act, a kitsch icon, a punchline on late-night talk shows. He laughed along, he played the role, he knew the game. But privately, something shifted. The desperation to be loved by strangers started to lose its power. The compulsion to perform started to feel less like validation and more like a cage. And the one person who'd never needed him to be Engelbert Humperdinck, who'd loved Arnold Dorsey long before the name change, long before the fame, was still there. Patricia became his anchor. Not in a romantic, cinematic way, in a quiet, daily, unglamorous way. She was the one who told him the truth, the one who didn't applaud when he walked in the room, the one who reminded him that he was more than the voice, more than the image he'd spent decades maintaining. And then, in 2016, she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Stop here for a moment. This is where the cruelty of the story becomes unbearable. Because Alzheimer's doesn't just take memory, it takes recognition. It takes the ability to hold on to the people you love. And for a man whose entire identity was built on being remembered, on being adored, on being seen, watching his wife forget him was a kind of death he couldn't perform his way out of. Patricia's decline was slow at first. Missed names, repeated questions, moments of confusion that could almost be laughed off. But Engelbert saw it happening. He watched the woman who knew him best, who forgiven him, fought with him, stayed with him through decades of fame and failure, slowly disappear. He didn't hide. He didn't run. He became her caregiver. For years, while still performing sporadically to pay the bills, Engelbert spent his days at home in Los Angeles, helping Patricia dress, eat, remember where she was. He hired nurses, he rearranged his tour schedule, he canceled shows. The man who had spent 60 years chasing applause from strangers chose to stay home and care for a woman who could no longer applaud him. In interviews during this period, he spoke openly about the disease. He cried on camera. He admitted he didn't know how to do it, that he felt helpless, that watching her fade was harder than anything he'd ever faced on stage. He said the hardest part wasn't that she forgot his name, it was that she forgot the life they'd built together, the inside jokes, the fights, the reconciliation, the 56 years of shared history. Gone. And yet, he stayed. Patricia Humperdinck died on February 5th, 2021. She was 85. Engelbert was 84. They had been married for 56 years. He held her hand at the end. He posted a tribute on social media, calling her his soulmate, his everything. The comments flooded in. Fans expressed sympathy. Fellow performers sent condolences. But none of them truly understood what he'd lost. Because Patricia wasn't just his wife. She was the only person left who remembered Arnold. This is what people don't see when they watch old clips of Engelbert Humperdinck in sequined jackets, crooning to adoring crowds. They see the performance, they see the fantasy, they see a relic of a different era, campy and over the top and faintly ridiculous. What they don't see is the man who went home to the same woman for 56 years, the man who cheated, was forgiven, and spent the rest of his life trying to deserve that forgiveness, the man who gave up the stage to feed his wife soup when she could no longer remember his face. Today, Engelbert Humperdinck still performs occasionally. He's in his late 80s now. His voice has thinned, his movements are slower, the audiences are smaller, grayer, nostalgic for a time when romance was sung in 3-minute ballads and the world felt simpler. He still wears the open-collar shirts, he still hits the notes, he still plays the part. But when the show ends, he goes home to an empty house. The clothes Patricia picked out still hang in the closet, her books sit on the nightstand, the photos of their children and grandchildren line the walls. And every morning, Engelbert wakes up in a bed that used to hold 2 people, and now holds only the memory of what they were. He has said in recent interviews that he doesn't fear death, that he believes he'll see Patricia again, that the loneliness is temporary, that the love they built, messy, tested, imperfect, was real enough to survive even this. But belief doesn't make the mornings easier, and faith doesn't fill the silence. This is the dark truth underneath the rhinestones and the ballads and the myth of Engelbert Humperdinck. The fantasy was never sustainable. The image was never whole. The man who made millions of women believe in eternal romance spent his real life learning that love is not a performance. It's a choice made every day, in sickness and health, in memory and forgetting, in the presence of applause, and in its devastating absence. The tragedy is not that he's forgotten by a younger generation. The tragedy is that the one person who truly knew him can no longer remember. Look back at the opening image now. The house that still smells like her perfume, the Grammy on the dusty shelf, the gold records in the empty hallway. That's not the story of a washed-up star. That's the story of a man who finally learned what mattered, and learned it just in time to lose it. Engelbert Humperdinck is still alive. He still sings, he still performs, but the performance doesn't save him anymore. It never did. The only thing that saved him was the woman who stayed, and now she's gone. Some love stories end with a kiss. Some end with a betrayal. This one ends with a man in an empty house, holding on to a name that was never really his, mourning the only person who loved him when he was still Arnold. If you want to understand what fame actually costs, don't look at the stages, don't look at the album sales or the headlines or the scandals. Look at what's left when the lights go out and the only audience that ever mattered can't remember your name.